All right, the Gospel according to Mark. Mark is in what's called the canon of the New Testament. The word canon means standard. The church in its early days had to set a standard by which some documents would be included and others excluded. Mark, to tell you something quite obvious to you, I know, is canonical. It was not always necessarily a given. And I want you to pretend for a moment that you are a Christian person living in about the year 200 AD. Christianity is still not a legal religion, but the most ferocious time of persecution is over. And for the most part, Christian people can live their lives in relative calm with an occasional sporadic persecution against them. But it's not a non-stop assault by this time. So you're living in about the year 200, and I want you to think about what you would consider at this point in your life the Bible. With respect to the Old Testament, it's pretty well a given. There was, in the time of Christ, 3 different canons vying for acceptance among Jewish people. There was what's called the Samaritan canon, very restrictive, only 5 books, the first 5 books of the Bible. There was the liberal canon, the Alexandrian. It included all of your Old Testament, if you're a Protestant, plus the Apocrypha, which is part of the Catholic canon of the Old Testament. But most Christian people at this moment in history had adopted what was called the Palestinian canon, which would be identical to what most Protestants consider the canon of the Old Testament. So that's pretty much accepted. Nobody's raising major issues, although there's certainly a continuing conversation. The issue is not quite so clear when it comes to the question of what we call the New Testament. There is no New Testament yet as such. Nobody's carrying around a bound volume that has a collection of 27 books in it, and we call it the New Testament. At this point in time, there's a collection of documents that are more or less independently circulating among Christian communities here and there around the Roman world. Some Christian communities accept some documents that others reject. Some are kind of in the margin, disputed. Some are universally accepted. And so at this point, it's a rather fluid circumstance in which the church is continuing a sifting sort of process. So anyway, at this point in time, there is, as I was saying, kind of a fluid understanding. Certain documents were widely accepted with no dispute. Others were more or less controversial. So that's the situation with respect to the New Testament. However, by this time, certain documents had at least been generally grouped into families. And so there was a body of documents that were commonly called the Evangelioi, the Gospels, and these were biographical in character, but also usually, always had an agenda as well. So it was not just biography, but it was also theology. And these documents, the Gospels, of course, would include Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and certain others. So there was one called the Gospel of Thomas that was getting traction. There was the Gospel according to Barnabas, and certain others that the church ultimately rejected, but at the time were part of the conversation. There was what are called the Pauline letters. These were more or less accepted when the ink was still wet on the page, They start off by Paul self-identifying, Paulos, doulos Christo Jesu, Paul, a slave of Christ. There were certain documents which claimed to be by Paul, but the church, I think, figured out fairly early they were spurious and rejected those. But for the most part, I think we're comfortable that what Paul wrote we received. There was one book that was somewhat questionable, Hebrews. Many thought Paul may have written it, others weren't so sure. It actually got into the canon based on the coattails of Paul, but later the church decided Paul was probably not the author, but Hebrews should nevertheless be there, so the authorship remains unknown. They're so-called Catholic epistles. These were intended to be circulated. Unlike Paul's letters, which were occasional, meaning they were written for a particular group of people for a particular reason, The Catholic epistles were intended to be circulated among the churches that were then existing at that time. And then there was, of course, the Apocalypse, the Revelation. We looked at this last spring. Many of you were here when we were doing that. So the families had been identified, but which books belonged in and which books didn't belong in various families remained a somewhat questionable proposition. The four, of course, that did eventually become accepted are the ones that we commonly think of: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew was symbolized early on. In fact, all of these symbols developed very early in the church's history, and we can't say who did it or when exactly it happened, but about as far back as we can go, we see these symbols. For Matthew, the symbol was a winged man. And that was in part because Matthew really highlights Christ as the coming Messiah, pictured in the Old Testament sometimes, at least in some people's minds, as a character known as the angel of the Lord. We find that character showing up, sometimes called a pre-incarnate Christophany. That is a manifestation of Christ before the incarnation. And so the Gospel of Matthew seems to be alluding back or referring back to that character, and hence this symbol came to be used to describe this one, the messianic character that we find showing up in the Old Testament from time to time. Mark was symbolized by a lion. A lion, of course, reminds us of the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the one who goes clear back to the patriarchal blessing announced by Jacob with respect to Judah, that he was the lion, you see, of the 12 tribes. He's represented, that is, the lion, as a figure of courage and action and authority. And I would say if you could find any three words that characterize Jesus in the book of Mark, it is those. Mark's, one of his favorite words in Greek is euthus, which means immediately. Everything Jesus does is immediately. He never takes a break. It's just bam, bam, bam. He's always on the move. He's a man, he's like Jack Bauer. He just never stops. He's just going, going, going. And you think, how can this guy keep up? How can he do this? But that's the lion aspect of him. That's the picture we get of Christ. He's also a man, of course, of compassion. He's a man of few words in Mark, in the sense that Mark doesn't tell us a lot about what he said, but he's constantly telling us that he's saying it. Mark is more interested in the fact that Jesus is teaching than even what Jesus is teaching. Mark is kind of that action-oriented character, which reminds me, Candy and I were in Hastings once, about 2 Christmases back, I want to say, and we were looking at action figures. I kid you not, there was a Jesus action figure. You ever seen that? I thought, Jesus made the big time. Look at that. He's got an action figure. Luke, characterized or symbolized by the winged ox or bull. This has a twofold meaning to it because, of course, an ox is famous for its servant status, its strength, its humility. It gives itself to serving and offering its abilities for the benefit of others. And at the same time, it was a common sacrificial animal. And much of the sacrificial system in Israel and other cultures used the ox. And Luke seems to portray Christ in that twofold kind of role. He's one who is, on the one hand, a servant, and at the same time, the sacrificial aspect of his career is highlighted there. John, finally, is symbolized by an eagle. We sometimes see eagles around here, and they make us look up. Eagles always make people look up, and when they look up, they think about the sky, they think about heaven, they think about things up there. And of course, John, more than the other Gospels, celebrates Christ as the one from above. In the beginning was the Logos, you see. The Word was with God, the Word was God, and so on. John gives us those kinds of themes more than any of the others do. And so those four taken together give us a kind of four-sided picture of the character of Christ. You've all heard the illustration of this. The four gospel accounts are sort of like looking at a great mountain from the 4 points of the compass. Every one is an accurate portrayal of the mountain, but they vary because depending on whether you're looking from the east or from the west, you're going to see some somewhat different topography. And so while they can all be accurate, nevertheless, there are variations among them, and it does seem that that's what the Gospels are there in a fourfold kind of expression in order to give us that varying perception of and description of the person of Christ. For my own money, I like other symbols for these four. I'll tie them to professions. I think Matthew is the CPA of the gospel writers. I almost feel like he originally wrote his gospel in a spreadsheet, you know? It's all well organized, everything is neatly placed where it belongs. Matthew will readily surrender chronology in order to make sure everything shows up in the proper column on his spreadsheet. And so I think Matthew is probably, and he was a tax collector, of course, so he was probably pretty good at keeping books before he became a disciple of Christ. Mark I call the trial lawyer. Mark is a guy who likes to make a case. He likes to talk with drama. He likes to make a kind of potent expression, giving an impact to his message, which is intended in some ways to persuade us. He's not overly intellectual in the sense that you have all kinds of lofty philosophical ideas going on, but he certainly hits us between the eyes with a very powerful presentation of the person of Christ. Luke, of course, the physician. When you read Luke's gospel, especially in Greek, you see he uses all kinds of language that ordinarily only a doctor would use. You know how doctors are? My apologies to the doctors in the room, I know, but you guys speak a different language. I mean, really. And so, you know, some people say he's bleeding, but the doctor says it's a hematoma, and you have that kind of... And Luke does that. Luke uses it. Don't talk about lawyers, you know. Luke does that kind of technical language. Whenever he's describing a healing, he'll more often than not, you see, give you some kind of vocabulary that you would expect from an MD of the ancient world. And so Luke is the physician. Of course, John, I'd have to say, is the philosopher. John is the one who gives us vastly more of what Jesus said and extends these discourses at some length, giving us then a much more reflective and kind of philosophical treatment of Christ. So anyway, the point is you have these four different views of Jesus reflecting these four different Gospels. Well, the one we're interested in is Mark. That's where we're going to be occupying our time. So what do we know about this Gospel? If we ask the question, what's the earliest reference to the Gospel of Mark that we're aware of in the very early church, the earliest reference would come from a character by the name of Papias. Papias, I love that name. We don't know much about him. He was certainly a venerated personality in the very early church. About the year 130, he's already a fairly old man, which means as a youth, he actually goes back virtually to the apostolic era. He writes quite a bit, but we have virtually nothing of his original writings. But a fair amount of what he said has been preserved for us by the guy that's sometimes called the father of church history, a character by the name of Eusebius. And so Eusebius reports to us what Papias said 200 years earlier. And so I'd like to give you Papias on the subject of the origins of the Gospel of Mark. And Papias says this, quote, "This also the presbyter," this is one of Papias' sources, by the way. He calls him the presbyter. It means the elder, but I prefer to call him the Presbyterian. So, this also the presbyter used to say, quote, "Mark indeed, who became the interpreter of Peter, wrote accurately, as far as he remembered them, the things said or done by the Lord, but not, however, in order." Now, this became a fairly important insight into Mark and how he developed his story. And it's been widely accepted, certainly was almost universally accepted, I would say, in the early church. And to this day, I think there's probably a broad consensus of New Testament scholars who would agree that Mark got the bulk of his information from Peter. Mark was associated with Peter, and in some ways you might call the Gospel of Mark the memoirs of Peter, you see. It's not a dictation thing. No one is saying that Mark dictated that Peter dictated and Mark just wrote it down. Nothing like that. This is Mark's work, but he's basing it, at least to some degree, on information that he acquired from Peter, probably later in Peter's life. Papias continues, "For he, Mark, had neither heard the Lord nor been his personal follower. But at a later stage, as I said, he had followed Peter, who used to adapt as though he were drawing up a connected account of the oracles of the Lord, so that Mark committed no error in writing certain matters just as he remembered them. For he had only one object in view, namely, to leave out nothing of the things which he had heard, and to include no false statement among them." And so here we have Papias giving a fair amount of credit to Mark and his integrity, his faithfulness in reporting what he got from Peter, but allowing that Mark is not just giving us a biographical sketch. He's not even trying to give us some sort of chronological treatment of the life of Christ. He's arranging his material for certain motives and a certain agenda, if you will, that I think becomes clear to us as we go along. So that's Papias. That's really the earliest comment on the origins of the Gospel of Mark that we have. Later, commentators follow that general thought. The next guy of importance that makes a reference to this would be Irenaeus, writing 50 years later, about the year 180, says this, quote, "After the deaths of Peter and Paul, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, himself also handed down to us in writing the things which Peter had proclaimed." By this time, it's become pretty well established and accepted that there is that connection between Peter on the one hand and Mark on the other. That, by the way, is a digital photo of Irenaeus taken in a Starbucks coffee shop there in Caesarea. Next guy on the block is Clement of Alexandria. Clement of Alexandria, again, about 50 years later yet. This is about the year 230. He writes, quote, "When Peter had publicly preached the word at Rome, and by the Spirit had proclaimed the gospel, that those present, who were many, exhorted Mark, as one who had followed Peter for a long time and remembered what he had spoken, to make a record of what was said, and that he did this and distributed the gospel among those that asked him." So we have one additional thought here, that Mark actually wrote at the instance of the community in which he was participating, presumably the Roman Christian community. So it may be that Mark did this more or less because people knew that he had this cozy relationship with Peter and might be in an advantageous position to record then the memoirs of Peter, who may have been off the scene by this time under the persecution from Nero. I mentioned to you earlier that the common view in the early history of the church was that the first gospel account was actually written by Matthew. And it was therefore commonly understood that Mark was giving us a stripped-down version, sort of editing Matthew to make it a little shorter, a little more portable. Augustine, for example, took that view, and he wrote in the early 5th century, quote, "Mark imitated Matthew like a lackey and is regarded as his abbreviator." I know that sounds a little bit disparaging. I don't know if the word lackey was intended to be quite as insulting as it may sound to us, but in any event, Augustine himself thought that Mark was actually just editing, as it were, the story that we get from Matthew. Mark was therefore regarded by many as a kind of Cliff's Notes, shortened version of Matthew. For people who didn't have time to read 28 chapters or whatever, they could read Mark's version and well. This is interesting because today it is widely accepted, I would say virtually universally accepted, with some notable exceptions, but certainly the vast majority of New Testament scholars would take the view that Mark was written first. And it does seem to make sense, especially when we look at some of the ways that Mark describes some things. He's certainly not simply stripping down Matthew. And I think we'll see that as we go along. I won't give illustrations of that right now, but we'll mention them as we encounter them along the way. Well, who is this guy that we call the author of Mark's Gospel? We name him Mark, although the Gospel of Mark never mentions Mark by name. There's no announcement anywhere in Mark that the book was written by Mark, and so this is strictly the church's later view of the subject. I think it's a correct view of the subject for what it's worth, but nevertheless, I think it's important to note that unlike Paul's letters, where Paul will start right off announcing the authorship, Paul, a slave of Christ, Paul, an apostle. Paul identifies himself, as was common in ancient epistles, ancient letters, but this particular work is anonymous. There is no indication of authorship. However, by the early to middle 2nd century, it was universally taken to be the case that Mark was the author. This is partly the testimony of Papias, but not exclusively. This was a very widespread understanding, and it seems to have had its roots in fairly reliable information coming down from the apostolic age. And so we're going to assume that Mark was the author of this document, and I think in so doing we are on fairly safe ground. It is also generally accepted, not only in the ancient world, but I think you'd find many, many scholars to this day who would agree that Mark is probably reporting the memoirs of Peter. We have evidence in the New Testament that Peter and Mark did form a fairly close association later in Peter's career, that Mark was there more or less as an assistant to him, and obviously they would have engaged in conversations, and I'm sure a lot of those conversations ranged back to Peter's own experience when he was a disciple of Jesus Christ during his earthly time here, and so that certainly would be consistent with what's otherwise known. So we're going to make that assumption as we go along as well. Peter himself writes in 1 Peter chapter 5, right at the end of his letter, these words, quote, "She who is in Babylon, elect together with you, greets you. So does Mark, my son. Greet one another with a kiss of love. Peace to you all who are in Christ Jesus. Amen." So we have that little piece of evidence again suggesting that Mark, among the many people connected to Peter, was in a special status, so much so that Peter would mention him by name as he completes his letter. The full name of Mark, when we run into him in the New Testament, is John Mark. The word John is actually a form of the word Jacob, the Jewish name Jacobos, or Jacob. Mark is a Roman name, as in Mark Antony, for example. And so what we have in Mark's name is really a bridge between the Jewish world and the Roman world. And that does seem to be precisely the role that he plays in the way that he develops his gospel. He's conversant with the Jewish background of the life of Christ. He presumably was there at the time. He knows the ins and outs of Jewish life, and yet at the same time he's quite comfortable in the Roman world, and many times will go out of his way to translate what was an event colored by Jewish background. He'll translate it in a way that it becomes accessible to a Gentile reader. And so we're going to see that, and his name, I think, is really emblematic of the entire way that we encounter his thoughts there in the gospel. The character John Mark in the New Testament is said to be the son of Mary of Jerusalem. Mary of Jerusalem appears to have been a reasonably wealthy woman, maybe a widow. There is at least some argument to be made. Some would make this case with a fair amount of vigor, that the house owned by Mary of Jerusalem was the house wherein we would find the upper room where Jesus celebrated the Last Supper with his disciples, and it may very well be the same upper room in which the disciples were gathered on the day of Pentecost. It is in any event a house that was readily and repeatedly used as a place in which Christian people would gather. You may recall that when Peter was in prison in Jerusalem and he was miraculously freed by an angel, remember that? And Peter gets out, this isn't a dream, this really happened, and he's out in the streets of Jerusalem. The first place he goes is to the home of Mary of Jerusalem. It's a funny story reported by Luke in Acts. Peter's there knocking at the door. A young maid named Rhoda hears him, comes to the door, pulls the little speakeasy thing. You know, what's the password? It's Peter, you know. She doesn't even let him in. She just runs back in screaming, it's Peter, it's Peter. And everybody thinks she's nuts. But it was Peter at the home of Mary of Jerusalem. And so she was a prominent person in the early church's life, and her home seems to have been a place which was a standard gathering place among Christian people. We also know of John Mark that he was a cousin to Barnabas. Barnabas never says a word in the New Testament, but his presence is always powerful. He's a catalyst for peace. He's a negotiator. He's a mediator. He's a peacemaker. And he's a guy whose presence shows up big in the New Testament canon. Of course, he was a traveling companion of Paul on his first journey and so on. We know that John Mark was a cousin to Barnabas, and so he had that connection as well. And we have at least some scant evidence, which I'll develop a little bit more a little later, that he may have actually been not certainly part of the inner circle of disciples. He's not there at all, but he probably was at least in that much broader circle of disciples, numbering several hundred. But I think it's safe to say that when Jesus was having his earthly ministry, the 3 years or so that he was involved, Mark was probably 12 to 13 years old, maybe 14. Just barely an adult, not old enough really to be living a life of his own, probably still living with his mother, but certainly aware of Jesus and having some kind of devotion to him, albeit as a young man at a distance. I'm speculating like mad here, but this case can be made at least with a certain degree of vigor, and I think there's something to be said in favor of that. The most dramatic moment in the life of John Mark in the New Testament is when he abandoned Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey. You may recall the story. Paul and Barnabas take off. They have a traveling companion, guy, I think he was supposed to carry the suitcases, you know, and his name was Mark. And off they go. It's about the year 47 AD. They go to Cyprus. They have a ministry there. They go straight north to what we would call the southern border of present-day Turkey, Anatolia. They go into this region, but it was about that point that Mark goes home. We don't know why. There's no indication what the reasons were. If he got cold feet, if he had, some nervous concern about the prospect of persecution or torture or something like that, whatever. But we do know that Paul made a mental note. This guy just abandoned us, and I ain't going to forget it. That was the mental note. So anyway, Mark goes home. Paul and Barnabas go ahead on their journey. Later, after the Jerusalem Council, which took place in 50 and is recorded in Acts 15, Paul and Barnabas decide to go on a second journey. Barnabas, always loyal, wants to bring his cousin Mark along. At that point, Paul began to speak Spanish. No way, Jose, it ain't going to happen. Not in this universe. And Luke is so honest that he says the division between Paul and Barnabas became so sharp that they actually split company over Mark. And Paul, unwilling to bend at this point, took Silas, and off they went on the second journey overland into present-day Turkey. Barnabas took Mark, and the two of them went on their own excursion heading back to Cyprus. And we don't hear anything more about them for some time to come, because Luke, of course, is mainly concerned in telling us the story of Paul. So we don't know what would have happened, but we can kind of guess the things at least were patched up by later. About 10 years later, Paul is in prison. House arrest in Rome. It's about the year 61. He's already spent 2 years in jail in Caesarea under Felix, and then was sent by Festus, you recall, to Rome to stand trial. And while he's there waiting a trial in Rome, house arrest, he writes what are sometimes called the prison letters. And the prison letters include among them one letter to the Colossians in which he makes this comment. This is Paul now, 10 years after the incident I mentioned earlier. Quote, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you. With Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you received instructions, if he comes to you, welcome him. So it seems that Paul has had a bit of a change of heart by now. This may seem like a sort of tepid affirmation, but nevertheless, it certainly shows a bit more warmth toward Mark than was the case earlier. However, I'm even more touched by the very last letter that Paul wrote. This is now quite a bit later. He's once again in prison in Rome, probably more like the year 67, possibly, or 66, more likely. This is not house arrest. There's nothing comfortable about this. He's in a dungeon. He's awaiting his probable execution. He knows it. The last letter Paul wrote was to his beloved traveling companion, the young man who was the disciple of Paul, named Timothy. And in 2 Timothy, Paul writes these words, quote, only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for ministry. And so that is a wonderfully rich testimony to the fact that somehow or other Paul and Mark were able to reestablish a relationship of trust, so much so that Paul would actually say of Mark, he is useful to me, I rely on him, and that is certainly warm affirmation by the apostle. Later tradition concerning the career of Mark brings us to this venue. How many have been there? A few? Yes, you mentioned it, didn't you? Yeah. This is known as? This is St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, right? If the picture were a little bit wider, you would see one of those Venetian canals right down to the right of the image that we have there. We were there in '93. I've been back a couple of times since. It's just a wonderful place to visit. If you're ever traveling around Europe, you don't want to miss Venice and you don't want to miss St. Mark's Cathedral. But you might wonder, how come Venice is the most celebrated place on the planet Earth with respect to the career of Mark, given the fact that Mark, to our knowledge, is highly improbable he ever made it to Venice, you know. So how did that happen? Interesting story. Mark, after the apostolic age was closing, after 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem, the church is more or less untethered from the temple. The temple's gone, untethered from Jerusalem. Jerusalem's gone. And the Christian movement now truly is the religion of the world rather than kind of a subset of the Jewish religion, which had been, at least to some degree, its reputation up until then. So now you have the apostles and the close followers of Christ going out as missionaries all over the place, and there's very strong evidence, support for the idea that Mark actually went to Egypt. And so he goes to Egypt and he has a career there as a missionary, and eventually he is martyred, as most of these people were, in Egypt and buried in Alexandria, which was a prized possession of the Alexandrians to have the burial place of Mark, the author of the Gospel of Mark, right there in Alexandria. Well, time went on. One of the interesting events that took place, 570, was the birth of Muhammad. He died in 630, and for the next 100 years, Islam spread like a wildfire across the ancient Near East, swallowing up vast tracts of real estate, including Egypt. So that by the time we get to the year 828, Alexandria is under Islamic control, but they still know of the burial of Mark, and they still treat it with respect. Well, by this time, Venice has become one of the wealthiest city-states in the world. Italy, of course, is not a country. There's been, Victor Emmanuel hasn't been around yet. Italy hasn't been united, and so there's independent city-states, and Venice was one of the most prominent. With its access to the sea, it had trade connections all through the world, including Alexandria. And so, by some kind of subterfuge, these Venetian merchants were able to spirit the body of Mark smuggling it out of Alexandria to Venice. At least that's the way the story goes. Once Mark's body was safely entombed in Venice, a cathedral was built. It was completed in 832, but it burned down in 976. At which time a second cathedral, the one that you see pictured here, was built and completed in 1093. Now there's a very interesting question as to how exactly did these merchants spirit the body of Mark out of Alexandria. I don't know if this is true. Contrary to the opinion of some students I've had, I'm not that old, and I don't know for sure, but if you've ever been here and you look at those artistic panels across the front of this cathedral, the one that is immediately to the right of the center panel looks like this. It is depicting the moment when the Venetian merchants were pulling a fast one on the Islamic authorities in Alexandria. The guys with the turbans on their heads are Islamic, of course, and they are the customs officers in Alexandria, and they're saying to these Venetian merchants, okay, fellas, open up your basket. What do you got in there, you know? And so the two guys opened their basket, and according to the story, what they had in there was pork, which from the point of view of the Islamic religion is an unclean and abhorrent food. And so you can see in the body language of these Islamic authorities, they're just recoiling, you see. Little do they know that wrapped up in the pork is St. Mark. And so they're able to sneak him out. Who says church history isn't high adventure? I don't know where that rumor got started. And so the Venetian merchants are able to spirit Mark's body out of out of Alexandria, take to Venice, and there it is to this day. At least that's the way the story goes, and I'm not going to dare to try to change it. When was Mark written? I'll be wrapping up with this. The narrative of Mark, and we'll see plenty of evidence of this. I'll try to highlight this. Virtually every week we'll see some evidence that Mark is styling his writing with a peculiar interest in encouraging Christian people in a time of persecution. The way he tells the stories, the way he arranges them, it seems pretty clear that he has in mind Christian people facing oppressive, abusive persecution from some source. The universal testimony of the early church, especially from Irenaeus, 180, Clement, 230, Origen, 250 or so, is that the persecution that was happening was Nero's persecution. If you were in my class on Revelation last spring, we talked quite a bit about this, of course. Nero blamed the Christians for the fire in Rome in 64, using them as a scapegoat, you recall, and that triggered a persecution of Christians, a horrific persecution in Rome itself, that pretty rapidly spread across the empire. This is the first imperial persecution. Up until that time, it had been Jewish persecution. Now it's Rome itself, who had been fairly benign toward the Christian movement up until that moment. And these three and others put Mark writing his gospel in the context of that persecution taking place at that time. Therefore, Mark's purpose is intensely practical. That's why you don't get a lot of extended discussions, extended sermons, nothing like you'd find in the other gospel accounts. This is Jesus, the man of action, meeting us at the point of our need with his authority, with his power, with his irresistible and compelling presence to give us comfort in the face of these trials. That's the picture of Jesus that we have in Mark. I mentioned to you earlier that it's commonly understood that Mark is the first of the synoptics, and I think that's correct. That would be my view for whatever it's worth. I'm not a big deal scholar or anything, but I think that it makes sense, and it helps us to appreciate the way that Mark says certain things, to realize he's probably the first guy saying them. He's basing it, of course, on the memoirs of Peter and other oral reports and so on that have come to him, but Mark is writing with something in mind, and I think we'll see evidence of that as we go along. All right, well, at the beginning, I gave you these two verses. Mark begins, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And as I say, that's probably a title for his whole work. It doesn't end on a particularly triumphant note. The last verse, I think there's very strong evidence, was this that I read to you earlier. So they went out quickly and fled from the tomb, for they were trembling and were amazed. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And there they go. And while there's not very much heroic about that, and the other gospel writers, Matthew, Luke, and John, both give a lot more kind of positive press to these women who were indeed very important in the story, Mark sort of leaves it hanging there in a kind of dramatic silence. And I think for Mark, now I'm speculating, so you can take this for what you think it's worth, but I think Mark is inviting us into the story, recognizing that we will see ourselves as similar people, not heroic, not great, not champions, not impressive, trembling, scared, running, not sure what to make of this. I think maybe there's a little cameo of Mark himself here. I want to tell in some detail much later the story that many believe is Mark's allusion to himself in a very odd little description from the Garden of Gethsemane. Some of you know it. It's only in Mark's Gospel. And it talks about a young man who was there in that kind of mayhem of the moment, wrapped in a linen sheet. A linen sheet, by the way, reflects somebody of some wealth. That term itself is referring to that. It appears to be someone who jumped out of bed in the middle of the night, didn't even take time to get dressed, but just wrapped himself in a sense in his bedclothes or a linen sheet or something he was sleeping in, running out into the streets to see what the commotion is. And maybe followed a group of people out to the Garden of Gethsemane, because there was quite a crowd apparently that had come along by then. And so he's out there. Nothing very heroic. And then to make matters worse, you recall the story, it's very embarrassing. It's rather scandalous, actually. We hear that somebody grabbed the linen sheet off his body and he ran out into the woods naked, you see. And I think Mark wants to invite us to understand that was Mark. Nothing much heroic about that. You know, he's just running for his life. He's just like one of these, trembling, anxious, not very courageous, naked. That in itself is just embarrassing. And I think what Mark wants us to do, and what he's inviting us to do, is realize this is the beginning of the gospel. The gospel didn't stop here. It has continued to be a story told to this day. And my friends, you and I, as non-heroic, as fearful, as trembling, as something other than great champion, all of us are part of that story. We can see ourselves in the mirror in this verse. And that should not be for us a great discouragement. It should be a huge encouragement, because this is the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's not the gospel of great men and women at First Presbyterian Church. Heaven forbid. It's the gospel of Christ, and yet he has been pleased to work out his purposes through the likes of us, and that is astonishing, and it's also reason for joy, because he can use even us running for shelter with these women, and yet he can use us for his purposes. And to me, that is highly encouraging. Amen.